"Ma'am, you need to stop talking right now." The officer's voice cut clean through the courtroom air, sharp enough to turn heads, but not sharp enough to shake her. Naomi Reed stood still at the edge of the defense table, hands relaxed at her sides, her posture straight but unassuming, like she had already measured the room and decided it wasn't as big as it thought it was. The overhead lights hummed faintly, casting a cold white glow across polished wood and pressed suits. And somewhere in the back, a chair shifted with a quiet scrape that echoed louder than it should have. No one expected her to speak again. Not after being told to sit. Not after being reminded, in that careful tone people used when they thought they had the final word, that she didn't belong in the flow of things here. But Naomi didn't move. Her eyes tracked slowly across the room, not defiant, not afraid, just precise, as if every face, every badge, every whispered assumption was something she was cataloging for later. Officer Ethan Cole stepped closer, the faint creak of his duty belt breaking the silence between them. He was used to compliance, used to people shrinking just a little when he occupied their space. "I said sit down," he repeated, quieter this time, the kind of quiet that expected obedience without question. Naomi inhaled once, slow and steady, like she was choosing her next breath on purpose, and when she spoke, her voice didn't rise to meet his. It stayed level, almost calm enough to be mistaken for indifference. "You're interrupting a proceeding you don't fully understand." The words didn't echo. They landed. A few heads turned. A clerk near the bench glanced up from a stack of files, her pen pausing mid-note, uncertainty flickering across her face before she quickly looked back down. Ethan's jaw tightened, just slightly, the kind of movement you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. "This isn't your place to lecture anyone," he said, a faint edge creeping into his tone now, something sharper beneath the professionalism. Naomi didn't answer right away. Instead, her gaze drifted past him, toward the empty chair at the front of the room. The judge's seat. High-backed. Still. Waiting. For a moment, the courtroom felt like it was holding its breath, suspended in that thin space between routine and something else nobody had named yet. Naomi's fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the table, the cool surface grounding, familiar, like she had stood in rooms like this before, rooms where people spoke louder than they listened and assumed more than they asked. "Procedure matters," she said finally, softer now, but clearer somehow, like the room itself was leaning in to hear her. A low murmur stirred in the gallery, quickly hushed, but not fast enough to erase the ripple it left behind. Ethan shifted his weight, one hand lifting slightly, as if to gesture toward the bailiff, toward control, toward restoring the rhythm he understood. But something about her stillness slowed him down. Not stopped, just slowed. Enough to notice. Enough to hesitate for a fraction of a second longer than usual. Naomi tilted her head just slightly, her expression unreadable, her eyes steady on his, and there was no challenge in them, no visible anger, just a quiet certainty that didn't match the role everyone had already assigned her. The fluorescent lights flickered once, barely perceptible, and in that brief dip of brightness, the room felt different. Smaller, tighter, like the air had shifted its weight. Somewhere near the bench, a page was turned too quickly, the paper snapping in the silence. The clerk looked up again, this time not hiding it, her gaze moving from Naomi to the file in front of her, then back again, something like recognition or confusion starting to form. Naomi noticed. Of course she did. Her eyes softened just a fraction, not in reassurance, not in apology, but in acknowledgement, like she had been waiting for that moment to arrive. Ethan exhaled through his nose, steadying himself, reclaiming the posture he trusted, the one that had never failed him before. "Last warning," he said, and this time, there was no softness left in it. Just authority, just expectation. Naomi nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if she understood exactly what he thought this moment was. Then she looked back toward the front of the room, toward the empty chair again, her gaze lingering there just long enough to feel intentional. The kind of look that meant something, even if no one could explain why yet. And when she spoke again, it wasn't louder. It wasn't sharper. It was simply final. "Then you might want to be very sure who you're giving that warning to." Silence followed. Not the casual kind. Not the background quiet of people waiting their turn. This was different. This was the kind of silence that arrived when something invisible shifted and everyone felt it, even if they didn't understand it yet. Even if they didn't want to. No one moved. Not immediately. The silence that followed her words did not feel empty anymore. It felt occupied, like something unseen had stepped into the room and taken a seat no one had prepared for. Officer Ethan Cole held his position, but the certainty he carried just moments ago had thinned, stretched into something less solid. He glanced, almost involuntarily, toward the front of the courtroom, toward the raised bench that still sat unclaimed, the high-backed chair casting a long, quiet shadow across the polished floor. It should have been filled by now. Everyone knew that. Court schedules did not drift. They did not stall. They did not leave space for confusion. And yet, there it was. Empty. Waiting. A faint sound broke through the stillness, the soft shuffle of paper again, but this time it did not stop. The clerk's hands moved more quickly now, flipping through pages, her fingers catching slightly on the edges as if the document had suddenly gained weight. Her eyes scanned line after line, then returned to the top, then down again, her breathing shallow, uneven in a way that did not match the calm order of the room. Naomi Reed did not look at her. She did not need to. She could feel the shift. It was subtle, but it was there, moving through the space like a change in pressure before a storm. Ethan cleared his throat, a controlled sound, meant to re-establish rhythm, to remind everyone where authority stood. "We are not going to entertain disruptions," he said, his voice measured, but tighter now, the edges no longer as smooth. "You will either take your seat, or you will be escorted out." The words landed, but they did not carry the same weight. Not after what had just been said. Not after the pause that followed it. Naomi turned her head slightly, just enough to look at him again, her expression unchanged, but her gaze sharper now, more focused, like a lens coming into clarity. "You are already entertaining one," she replied, her voice steady, almost quiet enough to miss if the room had not been listening so closely. A ripple moved through the gallery, small but undeniable, like the first drop of rain on a still surface. Someone shifted in their seat. Someone else leaned forward, elbows resting on their knees, attention fully captured now. This was no longer routine. This was something else. Ethan's hand hovered near his radio, not touching it, but close enough to suggest the option, to remind himself that he still had control over what happened next. But control required clarity, and clarity was beginning to slip through his fingers in ways he did not fully understand. He looked toward the bailiff, expecting alignment, expecting reinforcement, but the man's posture had changed, just slightly, his stance less rigid, his eyes moving between Naomi and the clerk, as if waiting for something to confirm what he was beginning to suspect. The clock on the wall ticked once. Then again, each second louder than the last. Naomi shifted her weight, not retreating, not advancing, simply settling into her stance, as if she had all the time in the world. Her fingers traced the edge of the table again, slow, deliberate, grounding herself in something real while everything else in the room began to feel uncertain. "Check the docket," she said, not to Ethan this time, but into the room itself, her voice calm, precise, directed toward the place where truth usually lived when no one else wanted to say it out loud. The clerk froze for a fraction of a second, her pen hovering above the page. Then she looked up, directly at Naomi, the hesitation in her eyes no longer hidden. She started, then stopped, swallowing the rest of the sentence before it could form. Her gaze dropped back to the document, scanning again, slower this time, more carefully, as if each word had suddenly become important in a way it had not been before. Ethan's jaw tightened again, the muscle working beneath his skin as he tried to hold onto the version of the room he understood, the version where roles were clear and lines were not crossed. "This is not your place to direct court staff," he said. But the statement sounded thinner now, less like a command and more like a reminder he was trying to convince himself of. Naomi did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply waited. And that waiting, that quiet refusal to rush or retreat, began to fill the room in a way noise never could. The clerk's hand trembled slightly as she reached the bottom of the page, then flipped it over, her breath catching as her eyes landed on something that made her still completely. For a moment, she did not move at all. Then slowly, almost carefully, she lifted her head and looked toward the bench, toward the empty chair, toward the space that was no longer just empty. Ethan followed her gaze. Just for a second. Just long enough for the first crack of doubt to settle in. Naomi saw it. Of course she did. And for the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not a smile, not satisfaction, just a quiet recognition that the room was finally beginning to see what she had known from the moment she walked in. The air felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken, something building just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it would no longer be contained. The clerk's lips parted, but no sound came out at first, as if the words were too heavy to move through the air without resistance. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the document, the paper bending slightly under the pressure, a small, physical reaction to something much larger happening beneath the surface. Ethan Cole noticed it. He did not understand it yet, but he noticed it, and that was enough to make his shoulders stiffen just a little more, his stance adjusting as if preparing for something he could not name. "What is it?" he asked, his voice lower now, controlled, but no longer entirely steady. The clerk swallowed, her eyes flicking between the page in her hand and Naomi. Reed, who still stood exactly where she had been, unchanged, unmoved, as if the room was finally catching up to a reality she had already accepted. "Officer," the clerk began, then paused again, her voice catching as she tried to align what she was reading with what she was seeing. She looked down once more, scanning the line as if hoping it might rewrite itself into something simpler, something that fit the assumptions everyone had walked in with. It did not. It stayed exactly as it was. And that was the problem. "The docket," she continued, her voice quieter now, but clearer, each word placed carefully, deliberately. "The presiding judge assignment, it was updated this morning." A murmur moved through the room again, but this time it did not fade quickly. It lingered, stretched, fed by curiosity and the slow, creeping realization that something was off. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Updated to who?" he asked, the question sharper than before, cutting through the rising noise, demanding a direct answer, something concrete he could hold on to. The clerk hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then lifted the page slightly higher, as if the document itself might shield her from the weight of what she was about to say. "Honorable," she started, then stopped again, her eyes lifting from the page to Naomi, locking there as if the name on the paper and the person in front of her had suddenly become impossible to separate. Naomi did not react. She did not nod. She did not confirm. She simply stood there, her presence steady, her gaze calm, allowing the moment to unfold at its own pace, as if she understood that truth did not need to be rushed once it had already arrived. The clock ticked again, louder now. Or maybe everyone was just listening more closely. Ethan shifted his weight, the faint sound of leather against fabric breaking the tension for a split second. "Go on," he said, but there was something different in his tone now, something less certain, like the ground beneath him was no longer as solid as it had been minutes ago. The clerk took a breath, slow and measured, then spoke the words that changed the room. "Honorable Judge Naomi Reed." The name did not echo. It did not need to. It landed with a kind of quiet finality that made everything else in the room feel suddenly misplaced. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. This one was heavier, fuller, loaded with the realization that every assumption made in the last few minutes had just been undone. Ethan blinked once, then again, his gaze snapping back to Naomi, searching her face for something. Anything that might contradict what he had just heard. There was nothing. No triumph. No anger. No satisfaction. Just the same calm, steady presence that had been there from the beginning. That was what unsettled him the most. Not the title. Not the shift in power. But the fact that she had known the entire time, and had not once felt the need to prove it. A chair creaked somewhere in the gallery as someone shifted, the sound sharp in the quiet. Another person leaned forward, eyes wide, as if trying to reconcile the image they had formed with the reality now standing in front of them. Naomi exhaled slowly, the breath barely visible, but enough to mark the moment, enough to signal that something had crossed a line and could not be taken back. She turned, not toward Ethan, not toward the clerk, but toward the bench, toward the chair that had been empty just moments ago, the space that had quietly demanded attention without explanation. Her steps were measured, unhurried, each one deliberate, the soft sound of her shoes against the floor carrying further than it should have in the stillness. No one stopped her. No one spoke. Ethan's hand dropped slowly from where it had hovered near his radio, the gesture unconscious, a small surrender to something larger than the authority he had been relying on. As Naomi reached the front of the room, she paused for a brief second, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the bench, feeling the polished surface beneath her fingertips, grounding herself in the reality that had finally aligned with the truth. Then she turned, facing the room, her gaze sweeping across the same faces that had looked past her minutes ago, seeing them now in a different light, not with judgment, not with resentment, but with a clarity that did not need to be spoken. The chair was no longer empty, and neither was the room. The weight of the room shifted the moment she turned to face them from behind the bench, not with force, not with sound, but with presence, the kind that did not need to announce itself to be felt. Naomi Reed rested her hands lightly on the polished wood, the surface cool beneath her fingertips, grounding, familiar, as if she had stood here 100 times before and the room had simply forgotten. No one spoke. Not the clerk, not the attorneys, not even the quiet murmur from the gallery that had filled the space moments ago. It was gone now, replaced by something tighter, something more aware. Officer Ethan Cole stood where he was, but his posture had changed, the squared certainty in his shoulders easing into something less rigid, less sure. His eyes stayed on her, searching, recalculating, trying to rebuild the structure of the moment with a different set of facts. It was not easy. It was not quick. Naomi did not rush him. She did not rush anyone. She let the silence settle, let it stretch just long enough to become undeniable. Then she spoke, her voice calm, even, carrying through the room without strain. "We will proceed with order." The words were simple, but they did not land the same way they would have minutes ago. Now they carried authority that did not need to be proven, only recognized. The clerk straightened almost immediately, her movements quick, precise, as if a switch had been flipped and she was back in a rhythm she understood. "All rise," she said, her voice steadier now, stronger. The hesitation gone as the room responded almost instinctively, chairs shifting, bodies rising, the sound of movement filling the space in a coordinated wave. Ethan hesitated for half a second, just long enough to feel it, then followed, his posture aligning with the rest of the room, though his gaze never left Naomi. She acknowledged none of it directly. She simply waited until the motion settled, until the room found its balance again, then inclined her head slightly, a subtle signal, and the room sat. The sound of chairs, returning to the floor, echoed softly, then faded into stillness. Naomi lowered herself into the chair, the movement controlled, deliberate, the high back framing her in a way that made everything else in the room feel slightly smaller. For a moment, she did not speak. Her eyes moved across the courtroom, not scanning, not searching, simply taking in what was already there, the faces, the posture, the quiet tension that still lingered in the air. When her gaze passed over Ethan, it did not linger, but it did not avoid him either. It was the same as every other look she gave, measured, neutral, unburdened by anything that had happened before. That, more than anything, unsettled him. He shifted his weight again, the faint creak of leather returning, a small sound in a room that had grown hypersensitive to every movement. His hand dropped fully to his side now, no longer hovering, no longer preparing, just there, still. Naomi reached for the gavel, her fingers closing around it with familiarity, not as a symbol, not as a tool of power, but as an extension of order itself. She lifted it slightly, then brought it down once. The sound was not loud, but it was precise, cutting cleanly through the remaining tension, marking a boundary that could not be ignored. "This court is now in session," she said, her tone steady, unforced, leaving no space for doubt. A breath moved through the room, subtle but collective, as if everyone present had been holding it without realizing. The attorneys at the tables adjusted their papers, their posture, their attention snapping into place, ready now in a way they had not been before. The clerk resumed her position, pen moving again, but this time without hesitation, each stroke confident, aligned with the authority now clearly defined at the front of the room. Ethan swallowed, the motion small but visible, his throat tightening as he processed the shift that had occurred not just in title, but in understanding. He glanced briefly toward the other officers near the wall, their expressions mirroring his own uncertainty, their stance less assertive, more observant now, as if waiting for direction that no longer came from them. Naomi allowed a moment to pass, just enough to let the room settle fully into its new structure. Then she spoke again, her voice carrying the same calm precision. "Before we proceed," she said, pausing slightly, not for effect, but for clarity, "we will address conduct." The words did not accuse. They did not rise. But they landed with a weight that drew every eye back to her. Every thought refocused on the space between what had happened and what would happen next. Ethan felt it immediately, the subtle tightening in his chest, the awareness that this moment was not over, that the shift in authority did not erase the past few minutes. It illuminated them. Naomi's gaze moved once more across the room, then settled, not sharply, not harshly, but directly, in a way that made it clear she was no longer speaking to the room as a whole, but to the truth that had unfolded within it. And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was expectant. The words lingered in the air longer than they should have, as if the room itself needed time to adjust to their meaning. "We will address conduct." Naomi Reed did not raise her voice, but something in the way she said it made every small movement in the courtroom feel louder, more noticeable, more accountable. A pen tapped once against a legal pad, then stopped. A chair shifted an inch, then held still. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed sharper now, cutting through the silence like a reminder that everything in this room was being observed. Naomi's gaze rested calmly at the center of the room, not accusatory, not emotional, just precise, as if she were placing each detail exactly where it belonged. Officer Ethan Cole felt it settle on him without her needing to call his name. His shoulders tightened instinctively, the weight of her words pressing into a space he had not prepared to defend. He had stood in courtrooms before, many times. He knew the rhythm, the roles, the expected flow of authority. But this was different. This was not about procedure alone anymore. This was about something that did not fit neatly into the structure he trusted. Naomi let the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. Then she spoke again, her tone unchanged. "This courtroom operates under federal and state procedural standards," she said, her voice even, controlled, each word placed with intention. "Every individual present is bound by those standards, regardless of position." The statement was simple, direct, but it carried a weight that shifted the room again, subtly but unmistakably. Ethan swallowed, his jaw tightening as he processed the implication. Around him, the other officers remained still, their presence no longer dominant, no longer directing the flow, but part of it, subject to it. Naomi's eyes moved briefly across the room, acknowledging the space as a whole, then returned, steady, focused. "Moments ago," she continued, pausing slightly, not to dramatize, but to ensure clarity, "those standards were not upheld." The words did not accuse directly. They did not name, but they did not need to. The room understood. Ethan felt it in the shift of attention, the subtle way eyes moved, not openly, not dramatically, but enough to register. Enough to make the moment real. He straightened slightly, the movement automatic, an attempt to regain structure, to re-establish control through posture, if not through certainty. "Your Honor," he began, his voice controlled, professional, but carrying a tension that had not been there before. There was a disruption. "I acted to maintain order." Naomi listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. She did not nod. She did not react. She simply allowed the words to exist in the space, then answered. "Order," she repeated softly, as if testing the weight of the word itself. "Order is not established through assumption." A faint murmur moved through the gallery again, quieter this time, more restrained, as if people were aware now of the boundaries they were standing within. Naomi continued, her tone still calm, but now carrying a sharper clarity. "It is established through understanding the situation in front of you." Ethan's gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, not fully, not enough to be obvious, but enough to feel, enough to register internally as something shifting. Naomi did not press. She did not escalate. She simply held the space, allowing the truth of the moment to settle without force. "Before any action is taken in this courtroom," she said, It is the responsibility of every officer, every staff member, every participant to ensure that the action aligns with the law, not just the appearance of authority. The words landed with quiet precision, each one reinforcing the structure she was restoring, not through dominance, but through clarity. Ethan inhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, as he tried to reconcile the version of events he had acted on with the reality now presented in front of him. The gap between the two was no longer small. It was visible, and it was growing. Naomi's gaze remained steady, not harsh, not forgiving, simply present. "Do you understand?" she asked, the question direct, but not aggressive, leaving space for acknowledgement rather than defense. The room stilled again, waiting, the air tight with expectation. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded once, the motion small but deliberate. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice quieter now, the edges softened, the certainty replaced with something more measured, more aware. Naomi inclined her head slightly, accepting the response without comment, without prolonging the moment. She did not dwell on it. She did not repeat it. She allowed it to exist, then moved forward. "Good," she said simply. Another pause. Short. Controlled. Then, with the same calm authority, she continued. "Let us proceed." The shift was immediate. Not dramatic, not loud, but clear. The courtroom adjusted, the tension easing just enough to allow movement again, the structure returning, but different now, more grounded, more aware. Papers were lifted. Pens moved. The clerk resumed her steady rhythm. Ethan remained still for a moment longer, his posture no longer rigid, but recalibrated, his attention fixed forward, no longer leading, but listening. And at the center of it all, Naomi Reed sat composed, her presence quiet but undeniable, not raised above the room, but anchoring it, holding it in a balance that had not existed before she spoke. The courtroom moved forward, but not the way it had before. The rhythm had returned, yes, but it carried a different weight now, like every sound had been measured before it was allowed to exist. Papers shifted more carefully. Voices, when they rose, stayed within a narrower range, controlled, deliberate. Naomi Reed observed it all without interruption, her posture steady, her presence quiet but anchoring, as if the room had finally aligned with something it had been missing from the start. "Call the first matter," she said, her tone even, unforced, signaling continuation without tension. The clerk nodded quickly, her hands moving with renewed precision as she read from the docket, her voice clear, practiced, but now layered with a subtle awareness that had not been there earlier. A case name followed, then another, procedural language filling the space, restoring structure in a way that felt almost therapeutic after the disruption that had preceded it. Naomi listened, her gaze shifting from the clerk to the attorneys, then to the individuals seated at the tables, each movement intentional, each observation quiet but thorough. When the first attorney stood, adjusting his jacket, clearing his throat, Naomi's attention settled on him fully, giving him the space to speak, to present, to follow the process that now felt newly defined. The attorney began, his voice steady, though a slight tremor lingered beneath it, as if the earlier moment had not fully released its grip on the room. He referenced filings, timelines, motions, each word aligning with the structure Naomi had just reinforced. She nodded once at a key point, not interrupting, simply acknowledging the flow, allowing the process to move as it was meant to. Across the room, Ethan Cole remained standing near the wall, his posture no longer dominating the space but integrated into it, his gaze forward, attentive, his earlier certainty replaced with a quieter focus. He listened, not out of obligation, but out of something else now, something closer to recognition. Naomi noticed. Of course she did. She noticed the way his shoulders had lowered slightly, the way his stance had shifted from control to awareness, the way his eyes no longer scanned for disruption, but for understanding. It was a small change, but it mattered. The attorney finished his initial statement, his final words hanging briefly before settling into the quiet. Naomi paused for a moment, allowing the silence to mark the transition, then spoke. "Counsel," she said, her voice calm, "clarify your position on the timeline referenced in your second filing." The question was precise, direct, and it shifted the focus entirely away from the earlier tension, grounding the room back into the work it was meant to do. The attorney blinked once, then nodded, flipping through his notes, his confidence returning as he responded, aligning his explanation with the expectations set before him. Naomi listened without interruption, her attention unwavering, her presence reinforcing the structure through consistency rather than force. As he spoke, the room settled further, the earlier tension dissolving into concentration, into purpose. The clerk resumed her steady writing, each stroke confident, aligned. The gallery leaned back slightly, the intensity easing, replaced by a quieter engagement. And Ethan, still near the wall, found himself shifting his focus not to control, but to comprehension, following the exchange, understanding the rhythm in a way he had not needed to before. Naomi let the explanation finish, then nodded once, a small, controlled acknowledgement. "Proceed," she said simply. The next attorney stood, the process continuing, the structure holding. Minutes passed, then more. Time moved again, but differently now, measured not by disruption, but by clarity. Naomi maintained the same steady presence throughout, guiding when necessary, allowing when appropriate, her authority expressed through balance rather than volume. At one point, a minor disagreement arose between counsel, voices rising just slightly above the established tone. Naomi did not raise her voice to meet them. She simply lifted her hand a few inches, a subtle gesture, and the room responded instantly, the voices lowering, the tension dissolving before it could escalate. "One at a time," she said, her tone unchanged, and that was enough. The exchange resumed, calmer, more precise. Across the room, Ethan watched that moment closely, the simplicity of it, the efficiency, the way authority did not need to be asserted loudly to be effective. It stayed with him. Naomi continued to guide the proceedings, each decision measured, each word placed with intention, restoring not just order, but trust in the process itself. And as the session moved forward, something quiet but undeniable took hold in the room, something that had not been there when the day began. It was not just respect, it was understanding, the kind that did not come from being told, but from being shown. And Naomi Reed, without raising her voice, without forcing the moment, had shown it clearly enough that no one in that room could ignore it anymore. Time settled into a steady rhythm, but something underneath it continued to evolve, something quieter than sound, yet stronger than routine. Naomi Reed did not rush the proceedings, but she did not allow them to drift either, her presence guiding the flow with a consistency that made even the smallest exchanges feel intentional. Another case moved forward, then another, each one handled with the same measured attention, the same calm authority that no longer needed introduction. The courtroom, once tense and uncertain, had begun to breathe again, but differently now, with awareness threaded into every motion. A witness was called to the stand, his steps hesitant at first, then steadier as he reached the chair, the faint creak of wood echoing softly as he sat. Naomi observed him for a moment, not with scrutiny, but with focus, as if she were aligning the moment before allowing it to continue. "State your name for the record," she said, her tone even, grounding, and the witness complied, his voice low but clear. The questioning began, simple at first, then gradually more detailed, the attorney guiding the narrative forward, building a structure of facts and timelines. Naomi listened, her gaze shifting occasionally, tracking the flow, catching details that others might overlook, her stillness masking the precision of her attention. Across the room, Ethan Cole remained in place, but his awareness had deepened, his eyes no longer scanning for disruption, but following the process itself, understanding the way it unfolded, the way each question led to another, the way silence could be just as important as speech. He noticed things now that he had not before. The slight pause before a witness answered, the way an attorney adjusted their tone when approaching a sensitive point, the way Naomi would lean forward just slightly when something mattered, then settle back when it did not. It was subtle, but it was there, and it changed the way he saw the room. The witness hesitated on a question, his fingers tightening briefly around the edge of the stand, his eyes flicking toward the attorney, then back toward Naomi, uncertainty rising just enough to be visible. Naomi did not interrupt immediately. She allowed the moment to exist, allowed the witness to find his footing, then spoke, her voice calm, steady, cutting gently through the hesitation. "Take your time," she said. "Answer only what you know." The effect was immediate. The tension in the witness's shoulders eased slightly, his breath steadied, and when he spoke again, his voice was clearer, more grounded. The attorney nodded, adjusting his approach, the exchange continuing with renewed clarity. Ethan noticed that too. The way authority, when used with restraint, could create space instead of pressure. It was not something he had been trained to see, but now, it was impossible to ignore. Minutes passed, the case unfolding piece by piece, each detail adding to the structure Naomi was quietly maintaining. At one point, a document was introduced, the attorney stepping forward, handing it to the clerk, who passed it along with practiced precision. Naomi reviewed it briefly, her eyes scanning the page, her fingers holding it steady. Then she looked up. "This document lacks a proper timestamp," she said, her tone unchanged, but the observation precise. The attorney blinked, then nodded, flipping through his notes, adjusting his argument accordingly. No raised voices. No confrontation. Just correction. Just clarity. And the room adapted instantly. Ethan shifted his weight again, the motion quieter now, almost thoughtful, as if he were recalibrating not just his stance, but his understanding of what authority looked like in a space like this. He glanced briefly toward the other officers, noticing the same shift in them, the same quiet attention, the same absence of urgency that had once defined their presence. They were no longer directing the room. They were part of it. And that realization settled in slowly, but firmly. Naomi continued, guiding the case forward, each decision measured, each transition smooth, the courtroom responding to her rhythm without resistance. When the questioning concluded, she paused, allowing the silence to mark the end of that segment, then spoke. "Next matter," she said, her voice steady, signaling movement without disruption. The clerk nodded, already prepared, her voice rising again, clear and composed as she called the next case. The cycle continued, but something had changed permanently, not just in the room, but in the way it functioned. The earlier moment, the disruption, the shift in power, it had not been erased. It had been absorbed, transformed into something that now strengthened the structure instead of weakening it. And at the center of it all, Naomi Reed remained composed, her presence quiet but unshakable, guiding the courtroom not through force, but through understanding, showing, moment by moment, what it meant to truly hold authority without needing to prove it. The next case began with a different kind of tension, quieter, less visible, but present in the way people held themselves, in the way the air seemed to pause just a fraction longer before each exchange. Naomi Reed noticed it immediately, not the case itself, but the undercurrent beneath it, the hesitation that had carried over from everything that had happened earlier. It was subtle, but it lingered, like a question that had not been fully answered yet. "Proceed," she said, her voice calm, giving space without forcing movement. The attorney stepped forward, his posture composed, but his eyes flicked briefly toward Naomi before settling on his notes, as if confirming something unspoken before continuing. He began outlining the case, his words structured, methodical, building a narrative piece by piece. Naomi listened, her attention steady, her presence unchanged, but there was a slight shift in the way she leaned forward, almost imperceptible, signaling that this moment required more than routine observation. Across the room, Ethan Cole felt it too. Not the details of the case, but the change in her focus. It drew his attention without effort, pulling him into a level of awareness he had not engaged with before. He found himself listening more closely, not just to the words, but to the pauses between them, to the rhythm of the exchange, to the way Naomi's stillness seemed to shape the space itself. The attorney paused mid-sentence, glancing at a document, then continued, but something in his tone shifted, a slight uncertainty threading through his delivery. Naomi's eyes moved to the document in his hand, then back to his face, her expression neutral, but attentive in a way that made the moment feel more precise. "Counsel," she said softly, not interrupting, but redirecting, "clarify the source of that statement." The attorney blinked, then nodded quickly, adjusting his explanation, referencing the document more specifically, aligning his words with the evidence in front of him. The correction was small, but it tightened the structure of the case, removing the uncertainty before it could spread. Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the adjustment, then allowed him to continue. Ethan watched that exchange closely. It was not forceful. It was not confrontational. But it was exact. It left no room for assumption, no space for uncertainty to grow unchecked. And that precision, that quiet insistence on clarity, began to reshape the way he understood what had happened earlier. The witness in this case spoke next, his voice steady at first, then wavering slightly as the questions became more detailed. Naomi observed him for a moment, then adjusted her posture just slightly, her presence grounding the space again. "Answer only what is asked," she said, her tone calm, not restrictive, but guiding, and the witness nodded, his voice stabilizing as he continued. The room responded again, subtly but consistently, aligning with her rhythm, her clarity, her control that did not need to be asserted loudly to be effective. Time moved forward, the case unfolding, but beneath it, something else continued to develop. A quiet recognition, not just of her authority, but of her method. The way she allowed space, but not confusion. The way she corrected, but did not diminish. The way she held the room without ever raising her voice. Ethan felt it settle in slowly, the earlier moment replaying in his mind, not with defensiveness, but with a growing awareness of what he had missed. He glanced toward Naomi again, but this time not to measure her, not to assess her position, but to understand it. The difference was small, but it was real. Naomi did not acknowledge the glance directly. She did not need to. Her focus remained on the case, on the process, on the structure she was maintaining. But there was a subtle shift in the air, something that suggested she was aware of the change, even if she did not respond to it outwardly. The attorney concluded his argument, his final words settling into the room with more confidence than they had begun. Naomi allowed a brief pause, then spoke. "The court will review the submitted materials," she said, her voice steady, "and issue a ruling accordingly." It was a simple statement, but it carried the same quiet authority that had defined every moment since she had taken the bench. The clerk nodded, noting the decision, her pen moving with precision. The room shifted again, preparing for the next transition, but the earlier tension did not return. It had been replaced, not erased, but transformed into something more stable, more aware. Naomi rested her hands lightly on the bench again, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. She glanced briefly across the room, not searching, not scanning, simply observing, then spoke once more. "Next matter." The words moved the room forward, but the impact of everything that had happened remained, not as disruption, but as foundation. And as the next case began, it was clear that the courtroom was no longer operating the way it had before. It was operating the way it should have all along. The next pause did not feel like the ones before. It lingered longer, stretching just enough to draw attention without announcing itself. Naomi Reed noticed it immediately, not as a disruption, but as a shift beneath the surface, something subtle but persistent, like a question forming in the room without being spoken. She did not move right away. Her hands remained still on the bench, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady as she allowed the moment to reveal itself instead of forcing it forward. The clerk prepared to call the next case, her fingers already positioned on the page, but she hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes flicking briefly toward Naomi, then toward the docket again, as if something had just caught her attention that had not been there before. Naomi saw it. Of course she did. She did not interrupt. She waited. The hesitation passed, and the clerk began to speak, her voice clear, controlled, calling the next matter forward. A woman stepped up this time, her movements careful, her shoulders slightly tense, as if carrying something heavier than the case itself. She took her place, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, her gaze shifting between the attorney and the bench. Naomi observed her for a moment, her attention quiet but focused, picking up on the small details others might overlook, the slight tightening of fingers, the measured breathing, the way her eyes held something unspoken just beneath the surface. "You may proceed," Naomi said, her voice calm, steady, creating space without pressure. The attorney began, outlining the situation, his tone structured, deliberate, but as he spoke, Naomi's gaze shifted again, not toward him this time, but toward the file in front of the clerk. There was something there, something small, something out of alignment. The kind of detail that did not interrupt the process, but did not belong in it either. Naomi leaned forward slightly, just enough to signal attention, then spoke. "Pause," she said softly. The room responded instantly. The attorney stopped mid-sentence. The witness looked up, uncertainty flickering across her face. The clerk froze, her pen hovering above the page. Naomi extended her hand slightly. "The file," she said, her tone unchanged. The clerk nodded. Quickly, gathering the documents and passing them forward with careful precision. Naomi took the file, her fingers steady as she opened it, her eyes scanning the contents with quiet focus. Seconds passed, then more. The room remained still, waiting, the earlier rhythm suspended in a space of quiet anticipation. Naomi turned a page, then another. Her expression did not change, but something in her stillness deepened, sharpened, as if the detail she had noticed was beginning to unfold into something larger. Across the room, Ethan Cole felt it again, that subtle shift, that quiet recalibration of attention that seemed to follow her focus wherever it moved. He watched as she reviewed the file, his own awareness tightening, following her lead without fully understanding why. Naomi closed the file gently, her fingers resting on its cover for a brief moment before she looked up. "This matter has been misfiled," she said, her voice calm, but precise enough to cut cleanly through the silence. A ripple moved through the room, small but immediate. The attorney blinked, confusion crossing his face. "Your Honor," he asked, his voice cautious now, uncertain. Naomi met his gaze, steady, composed. "The documentation submitted does not correspond with the case currently on record," she continued, her tone even, her words clear. "Proceeding without correction would compromise the integrity of the hearing." The statement settled into the room with quiet weight. No accusation, no escalation, just fact. The clerk's eyes widened slightly as she quickly reviewed her own notes, her fingers moving faster now, retracing steps, confirming what Naomi had already seen. I see it," she said softly, her voice tight with realization. "The reference number is incorrect." Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the correction without dwelling on it. "We will not proceed under incorrect documentation," she said, her tone steady, leaving no room for debate. The attorney exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance, recalibrating, his earlier confidence replaced with careful attention. "Understood, Your Honor," he replied, his voice more grounded now. Naomi allowed a brief pause, giving the room time to reset, then continued. "Clerk, correct the filing and reschedule this matter for proper review," she instructed, her voice calm, procedural, restoring structure without disruption. The clerk nodded quickly, already making the necessary adjustments, her movements precise, focused. The witness stepped back slightly, relief and uncertainty mixing in her expression, but she remained silent, following the direction of the room. Ethan watched it all unfold, the realization settling deeper now. This was not about control. It was about accuracy, about responsibility, about ensuring that every step taken within this room aligned with something real, something verified, something true. Naomi closed the file fully and set it aside, her hands returning to their place on the bench, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. She glanced briefly across the room, not searching, not questioning, simply observing the shift that had just occurred, then spoke again. "Next matter," she said, her voice even, moving the room forward once more. And as the clerk prepared to call the next case, it was clear that the courtroom was no longer just following procedure. It was learning from it, adapting to it, guided by a standard that had been present all along, but had only now been fully recognized. The room did not reset completely after the correction. It carried something forward, something quieter than tension but heavier than routine, like a memory that had not been spoken aloud but was now impossible to ignore. Naomi Reed felt it settle into the edges of the space, in the way people held their posture just a little more carefully, in the way each movement now carried intention. She allowed it. She did not clear it away. Some moments were meant to stay. "Next matter," she repeated, her voice steady, guiding the rhythm forward without forcing it. The clerk called the next case, her tone composed, but there was a subtle sharpness now, a heightened awareness in every word she spoke. A young man approached this time, his steps uncertain at first, then more deliberate as he reached his place. His hands rested at his sides, but his fingers moved slightly, a quiet sign of nerves he was trying to control. Naomi observed him, her gaze steady but not heavy, allowing him to settle into the space without pressure. "You may proceed," she said, her voice even, creating room for him to speak. The attorney began, outlining the situation, but as he spoke, Naomi's attention shifted again, not abruptly, not visibly to most, but enough to signal that something within the structure was not fully aligned. It was not in the words themselves. It was in the way they were being delivered, the slight mismatch between statement and confidence, the hesitation that did not belong to uncertainty, but to omission. Naomi leaned forward just slightly, her fingers resting together on the bench, her focus narrowing with quiet precision. "Counsel," she said, her tone calm, interrupting gently but deliberately. "Confirm the source of your statement regarding the timeline." The attorney paused, his expression tightening for a brief moment before he responded. "It is based on the initial report, Your Honor," he said, but the answer came too quickly, too smooth, as if rehearsed rather than verified. Naomi did not respond immediately. She allowed the silence to follow, just long enough for the gap to become visible. Then she spoke again. "Initial reports require corroboration," she said, her voice steady, "especially when they influence the direction of a case." The words did not accuse. They clarified. And that clarity shifted the room again, subtly but unmistakably. The attorney adjusted his stance, his confidence recalibrating into something more careful, more deliberate. "We can provide additional documentation," he said, his tone now aligned with the expectation that had been set. Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the correction, then turned her attention to the young man. "You may respond," she said, her voice softening slightly, not in authority, but in approach. The young man hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his voice low at first, then stronger as he continued, his words carrying a sincerity that did not need reinforcement. Naomi listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the room as he spoke, a quiet recognition that what was being said carried weight beyond the surface of the case. Ethan Cole felt it again, that subtle pull of attention, the way the room seemed to align around truth when it was allowed to surface without pressure. He watched Naomi closely now, not for control, not for authority, but for understanding, following the way she allowed space for the young man to speak, the way she did not rush him, did not redirect him unnecessarily, but simply held the structure steady around him. When he finished, there was a brief pause, not empty, but full, carrying the weight of what had just been said. Naomi nodded once, a small acknowledgement, then turned back to the attorney. "The court will require the corroborating documents before proceeding further on this matter," she said, her tone clear, leaving no room for assumption. The attorney nodded quickly, already adjusting, already moving to align with the expectation. Naomi allowed a moment for the adjustment to settle, then continued. "This case will be continued pending proper documentation," she said, her voice even, procedural, but grounded in the clarity she had established. The clerk noted the decision, her pen moving with precision, the structure holding without resistance. The young man stepped back, his posture easing slightly, the tension in his shoulders releasing as he moved away from the center of the room. Ethan watched him go, then looked back toward Naomi, something shifting deeper now, something no longer rooted in uncertainty, but in recognition. The earlier moment replayed again in his mind, not as a point of conflict, but as a point of contrast. The difference between assumption and understanding, between control and clarity. Naomi rested her hands lightly on the bench again, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. She glanced briefly across the room, not searching, not questioning, simply observing, then spoke once more. "Next matter." And as the clerk prepared to call it, the courtroom moved forward again, but not as it had before. It moved with awareness now, with intention, with a quiet understanding that every action within these walls carried weight, and that weight, when handled correctly, did not divide the room. It held it together. The room did not rush into the next case this time. It paused, not because it had to, but because something inside it had learned to. Naomi Reed noticed the difference immediately. The silence was no longer reactive. It was intentional. She allowed it to exist for a moment longer than necessary, giving it weight, letting it settle into something that could be carried forward instead of forgotten. Then she spoke, her voice calm, steady, guiding the space without interrupting it. "Call the next matter." The clerk nodded, her movements precise, her voice clear as she announced the case. But there was a subtle shift in her tone now, a quiet confidence that had grown out of everything that had happened before. A middle-aged man stepped forward this time, his posture straight but guarded, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He glanced once toward the officers near the wall, then quickly back toward the bench, as if recalibrating where his attention belonged. Naomi observed the movement, the instinct behind it, and the correction that followed. She did not comment. She did not need to. The room had already begun to adjust on its own. "You may proceed," she said, her voice even, creating space without pressure. The attorney began, outlining the case, his delivery structured, careful, but there was a difference now in how he spoke. Less assumption, more precision. Each statement grounded more clearly in what could be verified rather than what could be inferred. Naomi listened, her gaze steady, her presence quiet but directive, shaping the rhythm without overt control. Across the room, Ethan Cole shifted slightly, his attention fully engaged now, not scanning, not anticipating disruption, but following the process as it unfolded. He noticed the difference in the attorney's tone, the absence of shortcuts, the deliberate pace. It mirrored something he had seen earlier, something Naomi had established without ever stating it outright. The attorney paused briefly, referencing a document, then continued, his explanation aligned with the material in front of him. Naomi nodded once, a small acknowledgement, then turned her attention to the man standing before her. "You may respond," she said. The man hesitated for a moment, his fingers tightening slightly, then releasing as he began to speak. His voice was measured, but there was a strain beneath it, something unresolved, something that had not been fully addressed. Naomi heard it immediately, not in the words themselves, but in the way they were delivered, the slight tension between what was said and what was held back. She allowed him to continue, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, giving him the space to reach the point where that tension would surface. It did, subtly, in a pause that lasted just a fraction too long, in a sentence that ended without completion. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her attention narrowing with quiet precision. "Clarify your last statement," she said, her tone calm, but direct enough to guide the moment without forcing it. The man looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time fully, and something shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough. Enough for the hesitation to break. He took a breath, deeper this time, and when he spoke again, his voice carried more weight, more honesty, as if the space she had created had allowed him to step into something more real. Ethan noticed that. The way the shift did not come from pressure, but from permission. The way authority, when used correctly, could draw truth out instead of pushing it away. It stayed with him. Naomi listened as the man finished, her expression unchanged, her focus steady. When he was done, she allowed a brief pause, giving the words time to settle, then spoke. "The court acknowledges your clarification," she said, her tone even, recognizing the shift without highlighting it unnecessarily. She turned her attention back to the attorney. "Adjust your argument to reflect this statement," she added, her voice calm, procedural, but grounded in the clarity she had just reinforced. The attorney nodded quickly, already adapting, already aligning with the new structure of the case. The room moved with it, seamlessly, the earlier tension replaced by a rhythm that now felt intentional rather than imposed. Ethan exhaled, slowly, not realizing until that moment that he had been holding his breath again. He shifted his weight, his posture no longer rigid, but balanced, his presence no longer defined by control, but by awareness. He looked toward Naomi once more, but this time not with uncertainty, not with evaluation, but with something closer to respect. Not because of her position, but because of how she held it. Naomi rested her hands lightly on the bench again, her posture steady, her presence unchanged. She glanced briefly across the room, observing the alignment that had taken place, then spoke once more. "Proceed." The word was simple, but it carried everything that had been built in the moments before. And as the case continued, it was clear that the courtroom was no longer reacting to authority. It was responding to it. The rhythm of the courtroom had changed in a way that no one could deny anymore. It was not louder, not faster, not stricter. It was simply clearer. Every movement carried purpose now, every word placed with more care, as if the room itself had learned to listen before it reacted. Naomi Reed remained steady at the center of it all, her presence quiet but anchoring, guiding the space without drawing attention to the act of guiding itself. Another case progressed, voices rising and falling in measured exchange, the structure holding firm, but beneath it, something else continued to unfold. Not in the case. In the people. Naomi noticed it first in the smallest shift. A pause that did not come from hesitation, but from consideration. An attorney stopping mid-sentence, not because he was uncertain, but because he was choosing his words more carefully. It was subtle, but it mattered. "Continue," she said softly, her tone neither pushing nor pulling, simply allowing the moment to move forward. The attorney nodded and resumed, his voice steady, his argument grounded, but there was a difference now in how he presented it. Less performance, more precision. Naomi listened, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but her attention sharpened in a way that seemed to draw the truth forward without demanding it. Across the room, Ethan Cole felt that shift settle into him. More deeply than before. It was no longer something he was observing from the outside. It was something he was beginning to feel internally. The earlier moment returned to him again, not as a sharp memory, but as a quiet contrast. The difference between acting quickly and understanding fully. The difference between control and responsibility. He shifted his stance slightly, his shoulders relaxing in a way that felt unfamiliar, but right. The case moved forward, the exchange between counsel tightening as both sides adjusted to the tone Naomi had set. At one point, both attorneys began to speak at once, their voices overlapping just enough to disrupt the rhythm. It was brief, but it was there. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not strike the gavel immediately. She simply looked up, her gaze steady, and lifted her hand slightly. The effect was immediate. Both voices stopped. Not abruptly, not forcefully, just stopped. One at a time, she said, her tone calm, and the room responded as if it had always been that way. Ethan noticed that moment more than any other. The simplicity of it, the absence of force, the clarity of expectation. It stayed with him. The attorneys resumed, this time with more care, more awareness of the space they were working within. Naomi allowed them to proceed, her presence guiding without interruption, her authority expressed through consistency rather than volume. As the case approached its conclusion, Naomi leaned forward slightly, her attention narrowing with quiet precision. "Summarize your positions," she said, her voice even, signaling closure without rushing it. Each attorney complied, their final statements more concise, more grounded, shaped by the structure that had been reinforced throughout the session. Naomi listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. When they finished, she allowed a brief pause, letting the words settle into the room before responding. "The court will take this matter under review," she said, her tone calm, definitive without being final, leaving space for consideration rather than immediate judgment. The clerk noted the decision, her pen moving with practiced precision, but there was a confidence in her movements now that had not been there before. The room shifted slightly, preparing for transition, but no one rushed. No one moved prematurely. The rhythm held. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for a moment before lifting again, his focus returning to Naomi, but this time without tension, without resistance. Just awareness. Just understanding. He took a small step forward, then stopped, as if considering something, as if measuring the moment against everything that had happened before. Naomi noticed. Of course she did. She did not look directly at him. She did not acknowledge the movement outwardly, but her awareness shifted slightly, just enough to hold the space for whatever came next. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second longer, then spoke. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, but quieter than before, more measured, more deliberate. The room stilled again, not with tension, but with attention. Naomi turned her gaze toward him, calm, neutral, giving him the same space she had given everyone else. "Yes, officer," she replied, her tone even. Ethan held her gaze for a moment, then nodded slightly. The movement small but intentional. I understand now, he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Not as an explanation, not as a defense, just as acknowledgement. Naomi held his gaze for a brief moment longer, then inclined her head slightly, accepting the statement without expanding on it, without turning it into something larger than it needed to be. Then we proceed, she said softly. And with that, the moment settled into the room, not as a disruption, not as a conclusion, but as a quiet turning point that no one would forget, even after the session moved on. The courtroom did not feel the same anymore, even though everything looked exactly as it should. The walls had not changed. The lighting remained cold and steady. The polished wood still reflected the same quiet sheen under the overhead fixtures. But something beneath all of it had shifted, something that could not be seen, only felt. Naomi Reed sat at the bench, her posture composed, her presence steady, her hands resting lightly on the surface in front of her. The session had moved through its final matters with the same clarity she had established, each case handled with precision, each voice given space, each detail aligned with the structure she upheld. And now, as the last file was closed and the final note was written, the room settled into a different kind of silence. Not expectant, not tense, just complete. Naomi glanced briefly across the room, her gaze moving without urgency, taking in the people who had shared this space, the ones who had entered it with assumptions and were now leaving with something else. She did not name it. She did not need to. The clerk finished writing, her pen coming to rest with a soft, final tap against the paper. The attorneys gathered their documents, their movements quieter than before, more deliberate, as if the rhythm of the room had followed them even into the way they packed their things. In the gallery, people shifted in their seats, not rushing to leave, but not lingering unnecessarily either, each movement measured, respectful of the space they were departing. Ethan Cole remained where he was for a moment longer than everyone else. His posture was no longer rigid, no longer anchored in the kind of authority he had relied on before. It was different now, balanced, aware. He looked toward Naomi, not with uncertainty, not with evaluation, but with something quieter, something settled. He did not speak again. He did not need to. The moment had already said what it needed to. Naomi reached for the gavel once more, her fingers closing around it with the same calm familiarity as before. She lifted it slightly, then brought it down in a single, measured motion. The sound echoed softly through the room, not sharp, not abrupt, but clear enough to mark the end. "This session is adjourned," she said, her voice even, unforced, carrying just enough to reach every corner without breaking the calm that had been built. The words settled into the space, final and complete. Chairs shifted. Footsteps followed. The room began to empty, not quickly, not chaotically, but in a steady, respectful flow. The clerk gathered her materials and stepped away. The attorneys moved toward the exit, their conversations quiet, their tones subdued. One by one, the gallery cleared, leaving behind only the faint echo of presence that would fade with time. Ethan turned slightly, preparing to leave, then paused. Just for a second. He glanced back once more, his eyes resting briefly on the bench, on the space where everything had shifted without force, without noise, without anything that resembled what he had once believed authority needed to look like. Then he nodded, a small, almost imperceptible motion, and walked out. Naomi remained seated for a moment longer, the room now nearly empty, the quiet settling fully around her. The light from the tall windows at the side of the courtroom stretched across the floor, softer now, warmer than before, catching the edges of the bench, the grain of the wood, the stillness of the space. She exhaled slowly, the breath measured, steady, not from relief, not from exhaustion, but from completion. She stood then, her movements unhurried, her hand brushing lightly against the surface of the bench as she stepped away. No announcement, no final word. Just a quiet exit from the space she had held together without ever needing to raise her voice. The courtroom remained behind her, still, balanced, restored. And though nothing in it had physically changed, it no longer felt the same. Because for a brief moment, within those walls, authority had not been about power. It had been about understanding. And that was something no one who had been there would forget.